Hi friends, welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. We're doing Numbers chapter 22 today, and I've struggled really to give it a title. It's one of the few passages in the book of Numbers that I've heard people preach on. Thinking back to what they said, I've never really got a handle on what's really going on here. Well, perhaps until today. I did initially think of calling today's episode, Can God Get Angry with You? But no, that's not really the whole story here. And I think, well, for the title, it will probably appear it's just going to be Balaam's donkey. But anyway, I suppose there is the element of God chastising and getting angry here with Balaam and intervening as well. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I think the point to make is that in the big picture, you can't progress your way through the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. I know we're doing alternate books, but when you go through the opening books, you will note that God on certain occasions gets angry with his children. And in fact, you might say that sort of thing appears over and over again in the Old Testament. So the question, I suppose, is if God can get angry with us, what happens when he gets angry? Now, we've been going through the book of Numbers recently together, and we've seen several cases where the Lord got angry, haven't we? And we've seen the consequences of that anger. We even on occasion saw people get physically sick, or a plague hit the nation, and we saw people prematurely die who would have not have died that soon. So it's very clear that when God gets angry, particularly in the Old Testament, there can be really dire consequences. But they're usually framed within people reaping the repercussions of being left to their own desires. So today we arrive at this chapter in Numbers chapter 22, and it has to be said it has one of the most unusual stories, certainly in all of the Pentateuch, because it shows God getting, angry with this fella, Balaam, and the consequences in this case, how can I say it? They're very surprising. It's different from anything we will have seen or experienced in the Bible so far. So today we're going to turn together to Numbers chapter 22 and look at the story of Balaam. So welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, here we go. What can I make of all this? Well, the opening verses 1 to 5 roughly, are a sort of introduction to what's coming in the whole chapter. But before we look at it, let me just remind you that the children of Israel have now been wandering in the wilderness for nearly 40 years, and they've come back to Kadesh Barnea, and they've tried to go through the east side of Edom. And they're trying to go through Edom, but the Edomites won't let them do that. So they've skirted that area, and they've come to a place which is opposite the city of Jericho on the other side of the Jordan River. And now they're camped there, near but not in the land of Moab. Okay, let me read those opening verses for you, which frames what's coming. Then the Israelites travelled to the plain of Moab and camped across the Jordan from Jericho. Now Balak, son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Ammonites, and Moab was terrified because there were so many people. Indeed, Moab was filled with dread because of the Israelites. The Moabites said to the elders of Midian, "This horde is going to lick up everything around us as an ox licks up the grass in the field." So Balak, son of Zippor, who was king of Moab at that time, sent messengers to summon Balaam, son of Beor, who was at Pethor near the Euphrates River in his native land. Okay, so in these opening verses we've seen this guy, the king of Moab, Balak, feeling scared, terrified in fact, because of course he's witnessed the Israelites' victories over powerful armies and nations like the Amorites. That's happened already. And the Amorites were a group that had previously beaten Moab. So how's he going to feel about the Israelites coming in that knowledge? Now, despite being told by the Lord not to fear, Balak is gripped by dread. And the reason for his fear becomes clear when we understand that the Israelites and the Moabites shared certain kinship ties. And the Lord had instructed Israel not to harm them because they were kin, which also reflects the fact that God in himself had spoken to Balak. Anyway, Balak, still driven by fear, leads to seek out this man called Balaam, whom he hopes will put a curse on the Israelites. But here's the interesting part. Balaam seems to know the Lord. But although he seems to know the Lord, he's still drawn by the promise of the reward that Balak is offering. And this sets the stage for a conflict in Balaam's mind between obeying God's command and pursuing this offer of personal gain. So what can we learn from that, eh? Well, I think the first thing is that fear can distort our perceptions, leading us to sometimes act irrationally. But secondly, surely this is also teaching that the pursuit of money can be something that can lead someone astray from God's will, even if we know him. And Balak's story serves as the cautionary side of the tale against letting fear and dictate our decisions, and Balaam's response illustrates the same, but in terms of greed driving our decision making. But what else can Balaam teach us? Picking up halfway through verse 5. Balak said, "A people have come out of Egypt, they cover the face of the land, and have settled next to me. Now come and put a curse on these people, because they are too powerful for me. Perhaps I will be able to defeat them, and then drive them out of the land. For I know whoever you bless is blessed, and whoever you curse is cursed." So Balak's actions are quite fascinating here. Despite being near the promised lands, he sends messengers all the way to Balaam, based by the Euphrates River, seeking his help to curse the Israelites. Balak believes that if Balaam curses them, he will gain an advantage over them. So he's seeking to gain an advantage by which he can conquer the army of Israel. Now, Balaam seems to have a reputation, doesn't he? Those around seem to believe he has ability to bless or to curse people. Certainly Balak's request would strongly suggest that. Now, the identity and the motivation and personality of Balaam is a matter of great debate by many. Some argue that he was simply a pagan, an idol-worshipping false prophet, and they approach this story solely from that perspective. Others, it has to be said, including the very well-known Jewish historian Josephus, believe in fact he was indeed a genuine prophet of the Lord. Now, the Old Testament himself refers to him in other places as a diviner, and that's a practice we know that was forbidden by God in the nation of Israel. However, Balaam's sympathetic attitude towards the Israelites and the fact that he calls the Lord, refers to him as my God in the following verses, suggests that he might have been a believer at some level, but one who was still certainly engaged in pagan practices. So what's the conclusion? Well, I have to say, I'm not prepared to really definitively reach one, even though I'm sure many of you would like it. It's really challenging to determine Balaam's true nature definitively. He presents a complex figure, one who seems to have a knowledge of the Lord, but one who also participates in practices frowned by God. So certainly his practice and his motivations, as will be revealed later, fall far short of what one would expect of a follower of God. And this ambiguity is further complicated by references we find to him in the New Testament, which I'll come to later, but generally they seem to portray him in negative terms. Nevertheless, at this point, Balaam's summons to curse Israel will set the stage for the events that will unfold in the subsequent verses of the chapter. So I'll pick up the narrative again in verse 7. The elders of Moab and Midian left, taking with them the fee for divination. When they came to Balaam, they told him what Balak had said. "Spend the night here," Balaam said to them, "and I will report back to you the answer that the Lord has given me." So the Moabite officials stayed with him. And God came to Balaam and asked, "Who are these men with you?" Balaam said to God, Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab, sent me this message. A people have come out of Egypt, and they're covering the face of the land. Now come and put a curse on them for me. Perhaps then I will be able to fight them and drive them away. But God said to Balaam, do not go with them. You must not put a curse on these people, because they are blessed. The next morning Balaam got up and said to Balak's officials, go back to your own country, for the Lord has refused to let me go with you. So the Moabite officials returned to Balak and said, Balaam has refused to come with us. So that's the first major movement, if you like, of this chapter, if we were treating it as a symphony. We see Balaam's response here. Having received the initial invitation from Balak's messengers, Balaam's response, particularly in verse 8, when he mentions asking the Lord for guidance in this, is significant. In some translations, you'll notice that the Lord is spelt with capital letters, indicating that this represents he is using the personal name of God. Some would say Yahweh today. So this suggests that Balaam is in fact communicating with the true God of Israel at this time. He's not using false gods or idols of divination at this point. And when we see Balaam genuinely seek guidance from the Lord, he receives a very clear message, a very clear answer. He's told, do not go with them. You must not put a curse on these people, because they are blessed by God himself, in fact. So this is a pretty straightforward command from God, instructing Balaam not to go with the messengers and not to curse the Israelites, because they are in fact God's chosen and blessed people. And remarkably, initially Balaam obeys this directive, and he sends this first set of guys back to Balak, informing them that he cannot come because the Lord has forbidden it. So this initial response from Balaam highlights his obedience at this point to the instructions given to him by God, the true God, indicating perhaps there is a certain degree of genuine faith and devotion mixed in with all the false occultic stuff that's going on in his life as well. Anyway, verse 15 continues the story. Then Balak sent other officials, more numerous and more distinguished than the first, and they came to Balaam and said, this is what Balak, son of Zippor, says. Do not let anything keep you from coming to me, because I will reward you handsomely and do whatever you say. Come and put a curse on these people for me. So this is the second part of the passage, the second movement, if you like. We've had the introduction, we've had the first invitation, now it's the second invitation to come. Only this time he's sending not only more representatives, but more important, more distinguished people. So Balak was undaunted. He didn't pay attention to what the first lot of ambassadors says and the rejection that they brought, but he just responds by sending more of them a second time, and more important ones than the first lot he sends. And notice what he says to them as they're leaving. Don't let anything stop you from this man coming, because I say, make sure you tell him I'll honor him greatly. So he's telling Balaam to come because that's where the money is. Will Balaam follow the money? He's being promised a handsome reward, a handsome payout. And then on top of that, he says, I'll also do whatever you tell me to do. You could say he's almost saying, name your price. Just come and curse these people. So he's trying to sweeten the deal in every way he can. But Balaam, okay, I'm picking up the text again, verse 18. But Balaam answered them, even if Balak gave me all the silver and gold in the palace, I could not do anything great or small to go beyond the command of the Lord my God. Now spend the night here so that I can find out what else the Lord will tell me. So that night God came to Balaam and said, since these men have come to summon you, go with them then, but only do what I tell you. Okay. So Balaam's interaction here with God in verse 18, it's intriguing to me. On the surface, it seems like he firmly refused in any way to go or to offer a curse on Israel, declaring, even saying that if Balak were to give him a house full of gold and silver, he wouldn't go. But I sense the man protests too much. If you consider the context and Balaam's subsequent actions, it appears that there's more going on here than the sort of the flat narrative response meets and how that meets the eye. You see, in verse 19, Balaam still asks these guys to spend the night. He didn't have to do that. And he says he's doing that so he can inquire further of the Lord. Now, I think this suggests to me, and I've read a number of commentaries that say the same thing, but pretty much every commentary you read takes a different perspective on that. Anyway, the one that resonates with me is that I think he was hoping for a different answer from God this time, perhaps one that would allow him to go and receive the personal rewards to go with these guys, but maybe perhaps at this point still deliver the message of God. The key thing for many people approaching this passage is, at this point, for most people, major doubts are raised about the sincerity of his declarations in the previous verses. So now in verse 20, God does appear and does indeed speak to Balaam, and he permits him to go with these men, but under the condition that he only speaks the words that God has told him to say. So while God allows Balaam to go, it's clear that that was not God's preferred course of action. But he says if you're going, he warns him to only speak what he tells him to say, emphasizing that God will still indeed and intends to bless Israel. So while Balaam may have initially refused to curse Israel, his subsequent actions and God's response still that he is being tempted by the offer of wealth from Balak, and who knows how that might play out when the money's dangled in front of him or presented on the table in front of him. Now, the ambiguity of Balaam's motives here and God's response, I think, on one level, makes it difficult, but I also think it adds real depth and nuance to this narrative, because it raises questions about God's character and faithfulness to God's commands and how they work out in the battles of our minds and mixed motivations. And they are debated, it would seem to me, by theologians to this day based on this chapter. Anyway, let's continue with the story and see what can I say? It's all going to get a little bit weird. Balaam got up in the morning, saddled his donkey, and went with the Moabite officials. But God was very angry when he went, and the angel of the Lord stood in the road to oppose them. Balaam was riding on his donkey, and his 2 servants were with him. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road, with a drawn sword in its hand, it turned off the road into a field, and Balaam beat it to get it back on the road. Then the angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path through the vineyards, with walls on both sides. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, it pressed close against the wall, crushing Balaam's foot against it. So he beat the donkey again. Then the angel of the Lord moved on ahead and stood in a narrow place where there was no room to turn, either to the right or to the left. Now when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, it lay down under Balaam, and he was angry, and he beat it with his staff. Then the Lord opened the donkey's mouth, and it said to Balaam, "What have I done to make you beat me these 3 times?" Balaam answered the donkey, "You have made a fool of me. If only I had a sword in my hand, I would kill you right now." So this is a really surprising turn of events, isn't it? God has allowed Balaam to proceed with his journey, despite initially saying he couldn't do that. However, God's anger is kindled against Balaam. So there's a suggestion here that he knows that Balaam is musing on the situation on the journey, and in fact that he's going to be disobedient. So he sends this angel of the Lord to intervene. Now, the angel of the Lord is a complex term. I'm not going to go into it now. I suggest you look back in the book of Genesis at Jacob wrestling with the angel of the Lord, where I give you a full explanation of what I believe it means most of the time when we see this reference. But what I've said already, to sum it up in a phrase, when we see this word appear in the Old Testament, it is very often referring to what I believe is the pre-incarnate Christ. Anyway, here we have Balaam riding on his donkey, and did you notice it's the animal that senses the presence of the angel of the Lord, not Balaam, And not surprisingly, this animal veers off the path. Now, Balaam, likely, I believe, unaware at this point of this celestial presence of the angel of the Lord at all, just simply frustrated by this disobedient donkey, so he strikes it. And this happens repeatedly as the angel continues to obstruct the path in various ways. But here's where it gets a bit bizarre. The donkey speaks to Balaam, questioning why he's being mistreated. Let's hear what it says. The donkey said to Balaam, Am I not your own donkey, which you have always ridden? To this day, have I been in the habit of doing this to you? No, he said. Then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing on the road with his sword drawn. So he bowed down low and fell face down. And the angel of the Lord asked him, Why have you beaten this donkey these 3 times? I have come here to oppose you because your path is of a reckless one before me. The donkey saw me and turned away from me 3 times, and if it had not turned away, I would certainly have killed you by now, but I would have spared it. Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, I have sinned. I did not realize you were standing in the road to oppose me. Now, if you are displeased, I will go back. So finally, the Lord has opened Balaam's eyes, or at last he's responded in free will, and his eyes have become opened. Anyway, he's seen the angel of the Lord with the drawn sword, and he's pretty much overwhelmed by this divine presence. And Balaam, well, we see him fall to the ground in reverence, and the angel confronts Balaam, rebukes him for his disobedience, his twisted ways, his mixed motives on this journey. But I think what the passage really illustrates for me is you can't miss the fact that this stubborn donkey can recognize God's presence more readily than supposedly this great prophet, because this supposed great prophet is blinded by his own desires and disobedience. I think this is a powerful reminder of the consequences of straying from God's path and the importance of humility and obedience in our walk with him, and beware of what our true motivations are. So the closing passage is, the angel of the Lord said to Balaam, Go with the men, but speak only what I tell you. So Balaam went with Balak's officials, and when Balak heard that Balaam was coming, he went out to meet him at the Moabite town on the Arnon border at the edge of his territory. Balak said to Balaam, Did I not send you an urgent summons? Why didn't you come to me? I am really not able to reward you. Well, I have come to you now, Balaam replied, but I can say whatever I please. I must speak only what God has put in my mouth. Then Balaam went with Balak to Kiriath Huzoth, and Balak sacrificed cattle and sheep and gave them to Balaam and his officials who were with him. And the next morning Balak took Balaam up to Bamoth Baal, and from there he could see the outskirts of the camp. Okay, the close of this chapter. Well, what we're witnessing here is a complex interplay between Balaam, Balak, and perhaps even God himself. Balaam, very likely a pagan, seems to have some knowledge of the Lord, and on occasion he seeks divine guidance. However, his desires and motives are never entirely pure. He attempts, in a sense, to negotiate with God, but eventually, after flip and flopping, I think in the close of the passage, he's been seen to succumb to his own desires, because the chapter concludes with Balaam meeting Balak and participating in sacrificial rituals, possibly as a means of divination, some of the Bible experts say. So this closing shift towards pagan practices again highlights Balaam's continuing switching of allegiances, and it underscores for all of us the danger of compromising one's faith, and of course the means by which it done here is the offer of personal gain. So overall, this entire unusual chapter is meant to serve as a cautionary tale about the consequences of pursuing one's own desires over obedience to God's will. And I think it reminds us of the importance of humility, obedience, and genuine faith in our relationship with the divine. This chapter in Numbers, especially when viewed alongside its New Testament references in places like 2 Peter, offers several lessons for us and helps us understand it overall from a New Covenant perspective. Let me just read you 2 Peter 2:15. It says, "They have left the straight way and wandered off." So Peter's talking about people who have walked away from Christianity, and he says they've left the straight way and wandered off to follow the way of Balaam, son of Bezer, who loved the wages of wickedness, but who was rebuked for his wrongdoing by a donkey, an animal without speech, who spoke with a human voice and restrained the prophet's madness. Well, he did for a while anyway. So I think the major takeaway here in this Numbers passage is the concept of God permitting but not approving our actions. Despite warning Balaam not to go, putting obstacles in his path, God ultimately allowed him to proceed, and due, as we discover at the end of it, to his falsely presented motives, turned to paganism at the end, illustrating the principle that if we persist in our own way, God may very well indeed permit it. Even though it's not his will, even though he will send blocks along the way, ultimately he will allow us to follow the path of our choosing and pay the consequences. Now, another important lesson I believe to be gained by that is Balaam's particular character was motivated by his love for personal financial gain. His willingness to compromise obedience to God for the sake of monetary reward when dangled in front of him is meant surely to serve as an obvious cautionary example for believers everywhere, highlighting the dangers of you prioritizing mental wealth over righteousness. And that's truly a lesson for the modern church, I think. It's a battle I fight with this all the time, since I gave up my job to do this, to simply try and avoid focusing on funding this and monetizing this. Rather, my whole focus, I desire most of the time to be just allow the content that I'm creating to be good so that people will be motivated to support me in this vision. Anyway, I think Balaam's story emphasizes the importance of obedience to God's commands. When individuals like him are seen to stay from the path of obedience that God has laid before us, they not only risk just simply going astray, but they risk also falling into what God considers unrighteousness, complete sinful actions, and in this case, out and out paganism and divination. So overall, I think this chapter is meant to serve as a reminder of the consequences of such obedience, framed within this idea that the thing that can lead so much of us astray is that of pursuing personal gain at the expense of righteousness. It's so important we try to remain steadfast in obedience to God's will and not be drawn in this way. The story of Balaam and this donkey is certainly a fascinating one because it teaches us about obedience, greed, but ultimately the sovereignty of God. It's helpful to know that the New Testament mentions Balaam several times, and when they do, they describe his greed and disobedience. We saw it in 2 Peter. Jude also warns against this. Balaam is used as an example of pursuing profit at the expense of obedience to God. And this story surely must remind us to avoid that error of Balaam, because it was that error where we saw greed leading to disobedience. We should instead prioritize obedience to God over personal gain in every situation. That's the crucial observation. Don't become fixated on money or personal gain. It is a path that leads you astray and away from obedience to God. And I think is the primary warning of the path of Balaam. Whether that's in your ministry or any other aspect of your life, don't go the path of Balaam, and you need to be vigilant and prioritize God over everything else, including the pursuit of profit. And I pray that we all can have the wisdom and the discernment to know where our priorities ultimately should lie and avoid this error of Balaam that we've seen today. I'm going to close the podcast there today. I'm not going to do the usual outro because I'm already late for an appointment where I'm speaking at a church in about half an hour, and I've got 15 minutes to get there and set up. So I'll say bye-bye for now, and I'll see you back here again very soon on the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Bye-bye now.